Now I'd like to introduce Craig Hadebaugh, CEO at Simcon Software. Simcon Software is an expert in spreadsheet accuracy and EUC self-governance. We've helped hundreds of enterprises gain error-free spreadsheets and dramatically reduce their EUC risk through automation. Craig, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Let's get started. So in terms of a sneak peek about the conclusions from this presentation, essentially by storing your spreadsheets or other EUCs in the cloud, it actually is going to make it easier to mitigate their risks as opposed to more complicated. I know that may seem a little bit counterintuitive because when you think of the concept of your files being in some other spot, by extension, they must be harder to control and thus harder to manage and reduce the risk, but that's not the case. Part of the reason for that is some of the basic controls come free with these public cloud platforms. The cloud architecture actually gives you more options than you would have if you were to install some type of EUC governance or EUC control software within your firewall. And certainly when it comes to cloud and general benefits of the cloud, you can implement more effective controls in a dramatically less amount of time. And that's a huge, huge benefit for anyone that's struggled with trying to get the necessary resources to put some of your control infrastructure in place. It sounds almost a bit too good to be true. There really is only one catch, and we'll talk about it in more detail as the talk progresses. But essentially, you have to be careful when migrating existing legacy files. And above all, whether you're talking about the cloud or talking about governance software that's controlled or installed on your premises, it's still important to maintain a sustainable balance between what the line of business needs and what the people in risk management think is prudent in terms of managing the risk. If that's out of balance, it doesn't matter where the solution is hosted, cloud or otherwise, end users will ignore it, and ultimately the risk management regime collapses. So just quick terms of an agenda. We've scheduled a half an hour. I actually think this will only go about 20, 25 minutes, so let's continue. So again, whether you like it or not, whether senior management likes it or not, spreadsheets are still part of every company. There are literally thousands or millions of them within your company, depending on your size. But what's important here is we're really focused only on those spreadsheets or other EUCs that are used within a critical business process, whether it be some type of important forecasting model or part of a financial or regulatory reporting structure. It's only when an end user controlled file is used in the context of a critical business process. That's the point at which you need to worry. That's the point where you need to understand and evaluate whether the controls in place are effective. Certainly, when it is used within a critical process, it has to be correct. You know, if you make mistakes, and it's easy for people to make mistakes in spreadsheets, Excel doesn't make errors, people do. Sometimes those errors can be material. And so as we think about storing EUCs into the cloud, you know, does our risk increase or decrease? And that's really the subject of this presentation. So there's no doubt that the cloud is growing exponentially, especially as it relates to Microsoft Office files, which is the productivity tool of choice for most companies. You know, the use of Office 365, storing files online in SharePoint, SharePoint Online, you know, this is increasingly becoming the norm for many customers. Microsoft has stated that currently there's over 100, of the billion users of Excel, there's well over 100 million who are now accessing it via their online platforms. And in addition to Microsoft, there's certainly other companies. Box has commercial business-to-business enterprise content management platform, as does Dropbox, Amazon Web Services, and larger companies have their own private cloud. So this concept of we're only going to store the files on premises because we're afraid of security or some other reason, those barriers are rapidly eroding, and many more companies are storing these files online. So when you put the EUC in the cloud, there's several dynamics that are different versus the on-premises. So just by nature of the fact of where it's stored, that actually can do a lot to help reduce the risk that is associated with spreadsheets and other EUCs. On all of the public cloud platforms, this isn't necessarily true for private clouds, but on the public cloud platforms, many of the controls that are kind of the basic building blocks of sound EUC risk management are already there and free. So 5 years ago, you would have had to buy these controls software from a vendor such as SimCon or one of our competitors. But today, the basic controls come standard with the platform. However, we're going to go into some detail and make the distinction between file level and cell level controls. As alluded to earlier, when you're migrating spreadsheets to the cloud, this isn't as important if it's a Word document, but when you're migrating a spreadsheet, you've got the issue of links, and they typically are location specific, and those links will break. So it's a risk that needs to be addressed during your implementation process. Regardless of whether you're in the cloud or on premises, you still have to pay attention to the end users, the end user experience, trying to use automation so in order to minimize regulatory and compliance burden. That's very, very important. And ultimately, you want to provide tools and capability that help people in the line of business actually do their work. And then the fifth area that we'll go into more detail on really relates to IT infrastructure. And again, intuitively, you might think once we locate these files outside of our firewall, life gets more complicated. And in fact, it really doesn't get more complicated. You actually have a lot more options. So let's go into those in more detail. So first of all, just by virtue of the fact that you consolidate and store the business critical files in one location, that's a benefit in and of itself. And the great thing about the public cloud platforms is you can start small. Just a few people or a high-risk department, whether it's in accounting or perhaps in HR, or the people that are associated with a critical business process and need to share files between departments, you can start with a handful of 2, 3, 6, 7 users, whatever, and again, locate your business critical spreadsheets or other EUCs in that one place. And a byproduct of that consolidation is you now have a working inventory of the high-risk files. And it's a focal point for if you want to put additional controls in place, but you've achieved the basics. And in conjunction with the native controls that come with those platforms, just by storing your critical files on a public cloud platform, you've actually gone partway down the road to improving the effectiveness of controls and lowering the risks. Another side benefit that comes from the cloud is often, because it's general internet access, often accessibility is improved, and this is especially true for multinational companies that may have network bandwidth issues associated with, international locations, or perhaps organizational boundaries inhibit the sharing of files when they do in fact need to be shared. And by storing in the cloud, you can overcome some of those bottlenecks. And then, of course, information security, cybersecurity are #1 on many people's minds. And when you think about the resources that an Amazon or a Microsoft can throw at ensuring that their public platforms are secure, it vastly exceeds anything that the average company can devote to it. So in many ways, again, there's kind of this general perception that once it leaves my firewall, it's less safe, it's less secure, but the reality is those public platforms often have better defenses than most companies can replicate for themselves. So again, we spoke about file level controls and how some of those basic controls essentially come standard with the public platforms. So in general, when you read the literature from a Price Waterhouse or a KPMG, there's a list of about 10 controls that are associated with good EUC governance. And the basic ones in terms of access controls, version controls, et cetera, are shown on the left. But many of these basic controls come standard with the platform. So again, as mentioned earlier, you don't have to buy them from SimCon or anyone else. If your company has migrated to Office 365, some of these controls are already available and you just need to take advantage of them. In addition, there's value-added services that greatly assist with information governance. Again, data classification. Historically, that's been a separate silo of technology that you buy from a company that does only data classification. Now a lot of the classification technology comes inherent in the platform. Companies like Box have a value-added service called Box Governance, which again brings an additional secondary level of controls to files that are being stored in that platform. And finally, in terms of, many countries have restrictions on where data can be stored, can certain data leave the country or not, and all of the public platforms have built that compliance with local governance in, so you don't have to worry about it, you can just take advantage of it. Finally, as these enterprise content platforms, sometimes people would just call them cloud storage. Many of the vendors are trying to rebrand it in a more kind of highfalutin type term called enterprise content management. But as part of that suite of capability, people are building workflow in there and approval workflows and records of changes and who does what. Again, all of that is native to the platform, and you can leverage that as part of your EUC compliance and risk management strategy. So one thing that public platforms don't do are cell-level controls. So everything like in relationship to an access control or a version control is at the file level, but they rarely and almost never go inside the file. So in order to do preventative cell-based controls, such as locking of formulas or being able to map, cell C16, what other spreadsheets are that linked to, getting down to that cell-level data, you need additional software of the type that SimCon or its competitors produce. So this concept of more effective controls on your EUC, again, when you move them to the platform, you're going to get some of those controls by default, and it's only up to you to take advantage of them, but it will only get you part of the way there. It won't get you all of the way there toward what is generally accepted as the best practice for EUC governance. So as mentioned before, you need to be aware of breaking links. So, the typical spreadsheet that's used in a critical business process is often complex, and that complexity very often translates to connections to enterprise databases or connections between other spreadsheets. So this idea of, there's no spreadsheet as an island, the critical one is typically connected to several other places. And if you just pick that file up and move it to the cloud, it's not going to know where to find the other things that it's linked to. So this concept of just moving things without any forethought results in a lot of unhappy users and or business processes that no longer work. So this concept of understanding where are these links and what are they and how do we adjust them prior to migrating the cloud is a very important step that has to take place. And the volume can be daunting given that there's so many spreadsheets, which ones have links, which ones don't. Again, the good news here is that technology can help Technology can help you find and identify all of these links at scale. Technology can also help you in terms of fixing these links. So this really falls into the implementation phase of your migration to the cloud, but recognize that you just can't pick things up wholesale en masse and move them. There has to be some forethought given to the potential to breaking links. And again, whether you're on premises or in the cloud, you can't forget about the end users. I mean, what's in it for them? You know, the number one cause of errors in a spreadsheet are people. The code and logic within Excel has been proven over decades, and it doesn't have mistakes. So when errors get introduced, it's from people. And how can you help those people? How can you help them self-check for errors? How can you help them diagnose and find errors on their own prior to submitting their work up the chain to management? Just placing a documentation burden on them doesn't prevent an error. Just making them get a second signature or some type of approval every time a change is made doesn't really help prevent the error. It documents and satisfies some process, but it's questionable whether that really affects the core issue, which is the error. And then, of course, people who are reviewing files need automated diagnostic tools as well. So this goes back to the point about maintaining balance between first and second line. You have to keep in mind the people who are using these files, and if you want better risk management and you want to reduce the likelihood of error, you need to make sure that you provide tools that help the end users. And the last point here is in terms of IT flexibility. I've said a couple times today that when you move to the cloud, you actually have more options as opposed to less. So again, the basic controls are already in the platform. They're just waiting for you to use them. You know, in terms of more advanced functionality, whether it be discovery scanning or more advanced controls, this is typically server-based functionality, and those servers can be located within your company or on the cloud. And it's actually easier to connect a third-party server to the cloud than it is to do the reverse and have that talk back into your network. And technically, it's not that easier and not that easy. No, excuse me. Technically, it's not that more difficult, but kind of operationally and from a policy standpoint, especially in regards to information security, it's a lot more complicated because the concept of an external server having access to internal information is scary and for good reason. So again, when you have the files on the cloud, you have more architectural flexibility. There's extensive APIs on all of these public platforms. Just as a side note, for any of the companies out there who currently use Microsoft's control product, which is Audit and Control Manager Server for SharePoint, that product actually is no longer being supported and doesn't enable you to control Office files that are located on SharePoint Online. So if your company uses that today and you're migrating to SharePoint Online, you're going to need to provide another way to ensure that your controls remain effective. Then the last comment here is for the large companies out there that have had the resource to build public clouds, often they pre-build a secure VPN tunnel to both the Microsoft platform and the Amazon Web Service platform because so many tools are available there. And so there's a ready-made secure path to connecting a SIMCON control server or even one of our competitors' control servers to a private cloud and enabling better control of the EUCs contained therein. So again, bottom line here is that when you move your EUCs to the cloud and want to maintain or improve the effectiveness of your controls, you actually get more options in the cloud than you do as opposed to keeping them on premises. So the key takeaways here as we finish up are that you really should embrace the migration to the cloud. It makes EUC risk management easier. If you're not doing anything today, you can do a few things and implement some basic controls for no additional cost. And if you've got basic controls in place, you can further enhance and improve the effectiveness of those controls quite easily. And as always, technology can play a key enabling role. Technology isn't a panacea. It doesn't solve all ills. A lot of good EUC risk management practice is related to what people do and the processes that they follow. It's not purely a function of the technology that you buy, but the technology can play a role in terms of bringing you from the file level control of the platform down to the cell level control to give you the capability to accurately scan and automatically assess inventory and provide automated audit trails of changes that are being made to the high-risk files. And again, per the slide a few points back, technology can help reduce that migration risks that's associated with moving Excel files and the potential to break links. Again, you can use scanning technology to understand what are the files that linked, which ones are priority in terms of having the most links, the most complexity, and therefore you might make a decision to either not migrate them to the cloud or put them in a special category that need further work before the migration continues. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you.